overhead this morning. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Settings have been screwed up. No, looks like they're working. How are we all? Good? Good. Seems like this is taking on my background from my video. I should have spent more time setting up this morning, clearly. There we go. All better. Right. As usual, leave comments and questions and stuff, and I'll get to them at the end. You know the shtick of the show. I get up in the morning, throw up some news stories with interesting headlines that I haven't actually read yet, and give some ill-informed commentary. I turned the sound down on you. There we go. That's better. Yeah, because at least I have the decency to inform you that I'm ill-informed and this is a whole amateurish setup. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click the little bell, because my main channel is actually growing rapidly for me, but this one seems to lag behind a great deal. They don't seem to particularly prioritise streaming on YouTube anymore for some reason. Right, I'll leave the RPG stuff to the end to make you stick around. But let's get into the news, because there aren't that many stories, actually, that were interesting. In Mexico, and this relates to the coronavirus, weirdly, because of lockdowns and various issues in Mexico and other parts of South America, the governments there are pretty much failing to deal with it in any reasonable way, and the impact on people's lives is a lot worse than it is in more developed countries, where people can telework or have things delivered relatively easily and so on. And as a result, people aren't able to get food, they aren't able to get essentials, the government's not particularly helping. So who has stepped into the gap, do you think, in Mexico and across South America? It's the cartels, still awash with money from drug sales and so on. They're using the opportunity to try and get a measure of sympathy and support from ordinary people by stepping in where the government's failing and handing out food and various other materials, helping people out with money, finding them work to do. You can imagine what kind of work exactly. So the cartels, drug dealers, violent, murderous drug dealers, are winning over the hearts and minds of ordinary people in a situation where the government, because it's dysfunctional and corrupt and impoverished in a lot of these areas, cannot cope. So I guess buy your cocaine happy in the knowledge that it's going to help, that it's ethically sourced and is going to go and help impoverished people in Southern America, I suppose. That's probably the wrong lesson to take away from this, but there you go. Poland's been interesting politically, as me getting two words blended together. For a while, it's been sliding to the right in the same way that Hungary and Turkey have, and they just elected a fairly contentious, quite right-wing government in a pretty narrow vote, which represents a threat to LGBT rights in Poland. And I mean basic, fundamental LGBT rights, like the ability to exist openly and so on. Now, they don't have a huge majority, so how far they'll take it depends, but this was very much an election about people's rights in Poland. Because Poland, it's a little bit different than a lot of other places where we've had these right-wing populists come in, because Poland is very, very Catholic, very, very Christian compared to a lot of Western nations. And some people will say this is good, that they're cracking down on degeneracy and blah, 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 blah. When you look at the arguments in our countries that are being had that are pretty vicious and nasty, they're not fundamental arguments over people's rights to exist and so on. People still have a lot of discomfort. It's unfair, it's not right. People should be able to live as much as possible how they wish, but people seem to have been pushing for change almost too rapidly for the larger society to really cope with it, much as it should cope with it. It's just purely practical reasons. Might want to slow down and stop pissing off so many people. But in Poland, it's still pretty basic, fundamental stuff. But that's been taken as being too far, and this seems to have fed a backlash which has helped carry these more right-wing, not far right, not extreme right, but further right, I suppose, than the standard Overton window, people into power. Those stupid claims like LGBT is an ideology, which it isn't. There might be an ideology around it, but it's just as stupid as saying whiteness is an ideology. Just as divorced from reality. So, if you study history, you know that this sort of thing happens all the time when there's hardship. We've had a recession since 2008 that a lot of countries didn't really climb out of particularly. That's applied all sorts of pressure and has given us a sort of Great Depression 2 electric boogaloo, but not quite so bad, I suppose. And then we've followed that with, here in the UK, Brexit, which has affected us the most, but other people as well. Trump in the States, which has ratcheted things up as well. Bolsonaro in Brazil. You know, one thing after another, and it's all so predictable if you know history. If you look at the interwar years in the 20th century, for example, hard times tend to lead to political extremity and religious extremity. Yeah, we know this happens. It's a regular pattern. And now we've got coronavirus and a second recession, possibly even a proper depression coming after that. So little wonder that a lot of people are moving to political extremes. The hard right in a lot of places, the hard left in a lot of other places. And this does not bode well for our heroes. I mean, lessons were learned in the 20th century, but they've been eroded over time, whether it's relaxing controls on laissez-faire free market capitalism in the UK and the US, or whether it's simply not learning the lessons of history in the countries that are voting for these populist right-wing leaders. And the opposition to that just doesn't seem to know what they're doing exactly. So not especially hopeful, but we can take some comfort in the fact that this was such a narrow thing in Poland. They're not completely gone yet. In the States, speaking of right-wing populist leaders doing things wrong, coronavirus has roared back, but this time in more red states. And later in the year, so this may have a disproportionate impact on Trump's chances in the election. But it's Florida setting records now. The state recorded a daily case record of 15,299 people. So yeah, the virus is roaring back, but at the same time, restrictions are lifting. The US government's talking about sending people back to school. Now, it doesn't affect kids as much, but that doesn't mean it doesn't affect kids, and the kids are in contact with their parents and their grandparents and the teachers who are adults, and it does seem to be perfectly possible for people to be carriers or to pick up the virus on their hands and not be affected themselves and pass it on to other people. So now is not the time. But the US never really fully committed to the lockdown and left everything up to states, and that's why this is such a ragtag mess. So while huge parts of the world are unfurling and opening up again because they're able to, because they took it seriously the first time, America should be going into another lockdown, but probably isn't going to, because politics. So, yeah. What can you do? People are dumb, and at this point, people aren't going to follow orders. So. And here in the UK, our populist right-wing government, Priti Patel, the most inappropriately named woman in UK politics, is setting out more details of our post-Brexit immigration issues to welcome the best and brightest of global talent, which is a points-based system, which is going to be quite profoundly unfair. And there's mixed messages here, of course, as well, in which we're saying we're going to give Hong Kong Chinese a path to citizenship, which is great and good, and we should have offered that to the Gurkhas without having to fight for it back when, good old Joanna Lumley. But it's a mixed message, isn't it? You have to have 70 points to get in, and they're still fiddling around with some of the details, but still, you've got to wonder who would want to come in at this point. Maybe people for love, but that doesn't give you any points. So if there's a shortage of people in a particular area, they'll be able to get extra points. If you have a job offer, you have points. If you hold a PhD relevant to the job, you get points. Speaking English, points. Earning more than £22,000 a year, points, and so on. You know, it doesn't sound that awful until you consider the implications. You probably heard the term systemic racism tossed about. The key for me to unlocking and understanding what people meant by systemic racism was that it's not actually racism. Nobody involved needs to be racist. Nobody involved needs to be motivated by racism. So including the word racism is just kind of irrelevant. What they mean is that policies, either knowingly or unknowingly, affect people from different sectors of the society differently. So when you tighten immigration rules, in particular, what kind of groups do you think are going to be disproportionately affected by changes in immigration law? It's mostly going to be foreign people, and in particular non-white people from less developed countries with less developed educational systems, and so on and so forth. So the Tories are probably somewhat motivated by racism, because fuck the Tories. But even so, nobody involved at any point has to actually actively be racist or have any animus towards anyone of any particular race for this policy, or at least the effect of this policy, to be racist. Yeah, it's a bit of a headful, isn't it? But still. And the thing is, we don't particularly need the skilled workers to be able to come here and do work. It's the unskilled workers that we need, the agricultural pickers and so on, though it's unfair to call that unskilled. Yeah, we've been flying them in during the coronavirus pandemic to do the work, because otherwise the fruit and food and crops would just rot in the fields. But none of those people would be able to immigrate under this system. It seems to all be about playing politics and playing up to people, and it seems to be at the mercy of convenience. Labour's fortunes are on the mend thanks to Keir Starmer. He's quite an impressive leader, I think. He's not as left as I would like him to be, but he knows how to play the game, and he looks like a grown-up and an adult in the room whenever he's cross-examining Boris Johnson. A couple of missteps here and there. He's done things that have pissed off the left of the party, but that was always going to be the case. And like I say, he's not as left as I'd like, but he is at least electable, right? And he's giving Labour credibility and believability in leaps and bounds, particularly while Bojo and his little squad, they're all just fucking up constantly. So this may be an illusion. Maybe once we're out of the coronavirus pandemic and we're moving towards another election and things are a bit calmer, he won't look as impressive or as powerful. And yeah, the left wing of the party is being a bit of a problem because they want to be pure rather than electable. So they'd rather achieve nothing than achieve something if it requires compromise. But I think this is a misstep. Now, what they've done is that the Labour Party has joined an advertising boycott of Facebook over hateful material held on the platform. So this is a free expression issue. Are people allowed to be hateful? All right, it's a weirdly controversial topic. I think people are allowed to hold and espouse hateful, even erroneous views, and the best solution is to talk back to them, to counter the material that you see with positive material, to debunk what they're saying. It's hard work. It's much easier to rattle out a bunch of claims than it is to counter them. But even so. And this to me shows that there is still a shadow of the wokeness that came into the Labour Party with Corbyn, even though I don't think Corbyn was particularly one of these new left wokey types, woke scolds. I think he just kind of got carried along with it, like a lot of people do. And this shows that there is some of that hanging over, a certain Karen-ness to the Labour Party, if you will. And I think this is a mistake, because if you quit the field, then the people who remain, the hateful people who remain, they have a much clearer, more open field to project their material and to talk to people and convince them. We already have a problem in that right-wing people are willing to engage, debate, argue their side, argue their point, and left-wing people don't. They just block people and move on, right? How are you supposed to win if you never put the effort in to convince people? How are you supposed to be an activist if you never take the time to try and convince anybody of your point of view? I'm not doing their work. Why should I have to enact the Labour to convince you? Educate yourself. And educate, that's such an arrogant point of view. It's not about education, it's about persuasion, right? And if you quit the field, how can you persuade anyone? Now, if Facebook gives in, Labour won't be so hurt by not participating on Facebook and possibly Twitter and other social media platforms as well. But then if Facebook gives in, then we have a more oppressive atmosphere, and there's no way that human beings can do the moderation, so it's going to go to bots, and we all know how well that works, right, YouTube? Yeah, and I'm concerned. There's civil liberty issues, there's pragmatic issues. People have to be allowed to be cunts, unfortunately. Because if you don't allow that, then other things end up being restricted. I'm going to talk about the gaming stuff at the end, but I mean, look what happened. Right, D&D made sure that it was much more branded to sort of a teen-tween audience, and under a lot of pressure from woke scolds, they tightened the restrictions on what kind of adult content could be talked about, or produced, or sold. And everyone was, all these woke scolds were happy about that right up until the point that their queer-oriented material written for the DMs Guild suddenly got censored and restricted, even for the exact same reasons that they were happy for in other arenas, other areas. So the unintended consequences abound, and we should always be careful about restricting people's freedom, even if they're horrible cunts. For a while now, there have been schemes here in the UK to provide free home insulation to people's roofs and so on. There were schemes where you could get solar or wind, local home solar and wind installation subsidised, and where there was a scheme where they would pay some money to help replace old boilers. Not the slang meaning of old boiler, but actual boiler, which costs thousands, which lots of people can't afford to do, and a lot of boilers in homes are old and inefficient and not A rated, let alone AA or AAA rated. So there have been various schemes. They're bringing them back now. I've had some experience with these schemes. I applied for free loft insulation fitting, never got contacted because they farmed it out to private contractors. I've been phoned several times from heating companies about fixing our boiler or replacing it. I mean, it still works, it's just very old. It's installed in the 70s, I think. Still going strong, but not particularly efficient. And every time nothing comes of it. So you've got to wonder how this is going to work with them bringing it back, because it hasn't worked up until this point. The idea is good, but they probably shouldn't have farmed it out to a myriad of unregulated private companies who only seem to be willing to do it where they can turn a massive profit, where the job's easy, which tends to be in the houses that don't need it so much. So many good ideas ruined. There's a new rover going to Mars. The rover's called Perseverance. A lot of these rovers have lasted months and even years longer than they were ever intended to. But of course, travelling to Mars and landing is fraught with danger. Many probes and rovers have been smashed before they could do anything. But naming one Perseverance, it's asking for trouble, I think. This one will probably last less long than their others. So this is the latest one in a series of different rovers that have been going looking for life in particular. Yeah, we sent the Viking landers and we assumed that they proved that Mars had no life, but we keep finding promising signs from these other rovers, and they keep narrowing down the experiments and making them more effective with each generation. And rovers are, of course, able to poodle around and check all kinds of different places. Perseverance is going to land in the Jezero crater near the Martian equator, where things are warmest, so perhaps a chance of seeing some liquid water somewhere beneath the surface, or some more ice, because we have found signs of water, and so on. What they're looking for is not active life, not real living creatures, but fossil life. Signs that there was biology in the past. There's numerous signals of that you can look for in geology. Now, this rover also carries a drone, a helicopter, which will test and hopefully prove that you can fly decently on Mars. Now, Mars has a very thin atmosphere, relatively low gravity, which accounts for that. But also that means the gravity's low. So the aerodynamics of flying on Mars are different, and this is all based on simulations, obviously, and hopefully this will be a proof of contact, because flying drones can cover a hell of a lot more ground, investigate a lot more widely, and give us a more detailed survey of large areas of the Martian surface. So if that works, we probably won't learn that much from this drone, but we'll be able to refine the technology and the aerodynamics and so on, and then maybe the next one will be even better. So here's hoping. They're also thinking at some point of putting aerostat drones in the Venusian atmosphere, but we're unlikely to see life or anything on Venus, but it's just those would be above the heat, above the worst of things, and might be able to gather more information on Venus. It's even been suggested that we colonise it using giant blimps, but yeah, that's going to be a long way off, I reckon. But still, exciting news. New rover, much more specifically tooled for looking for life, and with a drone. And even if the drone immediately crashes, like most drones tend to, we'll at least have learned something from it about Martian aerodynamics. And I'm curious to see what planes built to Martian aerodynamics look like. There's been some mock-ups of like gliders and things. Very interesting. Just that slight alienness, even though they're built for entirely pragmatic reasons. More bad news here in the UK, quite apart from all the Brexit mess, which is flaring up again. Our water supplies are at risk. You wouldn't think so in Britain. You wouldn't think so in England. We're famous for the rain and it pouring down. And down here we have these big chalk aquifers, so our water's quite chalky. It's good calcium, good for your bones. But it gets worse when it runs low. We don't have a unified national system for our water distribution, which is why certain areas can run dry while others are flooded, which is a bit silly. And this hasn't been helped by the fact that water supply got privatized and there's a whole bunch of different competing companies, though it's not really a competitive area. But the problem is that they have underinvested. For many, many, many years, my village has had problems with the sewerage. They keep building new houses out here as fields and so on get sold off because it's more profitable to rent or sell the land, right? And that puts more and more strain on the old sewerage system, which was never meant for this many people. And since before the year 2000, we've had problems here since the early 90s, in fact. They still haven't fixed it. We still get trucks out to pump the water and the sewage out when it gets too high. The private companies just aren't set up to deal with this kind of long-term thinking and issues because they don't want to spend the money. So DEFRA, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, hasn't been holding people to account, hasn't shown leadership, and the water companies have failed to act because there's no profit in it. It's a big, expensive investments that won't pay off for years. And look, this is why infrastructure is often better off being nationalised. Because, in a democracy, governments don't have a particularly long-term vision, but it is possible. And if you consolidate infrastructure, like water, like power, like roads and so on, it is much easier for them to make these kind of long-term investments, or to make the case to government for the funding to make these long-term investments, which private companies are pretty terrible at, unfortunately. Maybe if we were all immortals. Last story before I delve into the RPG stuff that's been going on. I've worked from home since about 2002. Lots of people have been thrust into that same situation due to the coronavirus. And apparently it's causing a huge amount of burnout. And I can sympathise with and understand that. Right? Since March, we've all been encouraged to work from home. No difference for me, big difference for a lot of other people. But people working from home have been working harder and doing longer hours than they would in the office. And this is causing people to burn out. That sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? Most people's image of someone who works from home is someone who gets up around midday in their pyjamas, does their day's work in a couple of hours in the afternoon, and spends the rest of the day drinking and eating bonbons or something. But it's not like that. There is a lot of personal pressure on you to work as much as you can and as hard as you can when you're working from home. The day doesn't get divided up, right? There's no commute. There's no sort of set lunchtime or negotiation of lunchtime. You don't necessarily get a sense of the passage of time or your hours, particularly if you work for yourself. If you're self-employed, as I am, you feel even more pressure to work beyond your allotted hours. Unpaid overtime is a big thing anyway in normal business, but if you work for yourself, every hour you're not working is time you're not earning money. And many self-employed careers aren't necessarily particularly stable or don't necessarily pay out a huge amount. So you have to be self-disciplined both to work and not to work, to take breaks, to take days off, to have holiday. I haven't really taken a day off except some brief issues for illness this year, for example. I don't go on holidays. I'm fairly strict about knocking off because I have to go and make dinner. That's how you structure your day. But it's difficult for a lot of people. A lot of people don't have self-discipline either way, either to make themselves work or not. But this shows also why I think we might see a shift in this kind of attitude because we've basically demonstrated through coronavirus that many people can work from home, even though their bosses are resistant to the idea, or whatever else. But at the same time, we're also showing just how much work people can get done from home, and that it's possible, and they may well get more work done. So I'm hoping, for other people's sake, that post-corona, this will be more of a thing, because it's good for the environment, it's good for people once they strike their work-life balance properly. They can be around their kids more, they can look after their kids more, there's less pressure on childcare, they get more work done, it's more efficient, there's less trips, you don't have the commute, you don't have all the pollution associated with the commute. It's cheaper for a lot of businesses if they don't have to have a huge central office that everyone works out of. If most of your workforce can work from home, you don't have to pay for office space, or power, or air conditioning, or any of the myriad of other issues. If you have to have a central office, you can have a smaller one. You can rotate people in and out. This could be a huge boon to business, particularly staring down, Brexit and a COVID-related recession. This would be a way to cut costs. Put a lot of your work into virtual online meetings all the time instead of just this now, and voice over IP. If you run call centers, there's no reason that can't be channeled to people's phones wherever they are. But it does blur work and non-work, but then that's already happening anyway. So I think the positives outweigh the negatives, but it remains to be seen whether that change will actually come through. Right, well, I'm going to rant for a bit about stuff in the RPG industry now, so pop any comments or anything you want to make in now, because there is considerable lag, and I will get to that as quick and as best as I can after the rant. If you've not been paying attention to the RPG industry, it is a fairly hot locus of the culture war. Same's true of computer games to an extent. Entertainment of all kinds is a pretty hotly contested ground of fighting. And while I hesitate to quote Breitbart, the idea that politics is downstream from culture is probably pretty true. And that's why the fighting, I think, is quite so vicious in sort of media and cultural circles. The fighting's so vicious because the stakes are so small, as they used to say about academia, but are the stakes that small? Creativity is where you need free speech and free expression and the freedom to do whatever more almost than anywhere else, because without it you end up with trite and boring material, or worse, you end up with something pretentious or a double standard where exploring certain topics is fine if you've got the right skin colour or the right religious background or the right political background. Then it's fine for you to explore certain things, but it's not if you're not. Right? And this is censorship. Censorship by social convention and self-censorship. Yeah, and that's dangerous. You have to have the room to fuck up, to tackle difficult topics. You shouldn't have to be Asian to write about Asian things or history, or black to write about black things or history, or Jewish to write about Jewish things or history. Anyone can learn about this stuff, and it's a useful thing to be able to explore and understand it. When it comes to gaming, from my experience, though albeit that's mostly from a European perspective, I have travelled the world and interacted with gaming communities all around the world. By and large, gamers have tended to be more progressive and more forward-thinking than other communities. I'm talking specifically about tabletop gamers, but I think that's also true of computer games to an extent. But they're now so ubiquitous that they probably closer reflect average society. But in tabletop games, there's definitely been more of an old school, more of a liberal, more of a small L libertarian bent to the community for many years. Why is that? It's a creative enterprise. The whole RPG culture grew out of the universities, which have always tended to be more left, more liberal. And I think just the sheer act of role-playing, putting yourself in other people's shoes, even if it is in a fantasy world, I think that lends one to compassion and empathy and trying to understand the other point of view. Which is why it's so weird to me that the attacks on tabletop gaming have been so vicious and they bear so little relation to reality. As well, obviously, of course, we have the satanic panic and the vampire panic and so on, and that has bred a certain militant resistance to censorship within the RPG community, or at least anyone that came up through it through the 80s and 90s. Less so since then, once that all died down. But we're now in the middle of a third moral panic, where everything is racist, everything is sexist, everything is bigoted in some way, and you have to point it out. But that doesn't reflect the RPG community that most of us grognards know, right? Because we know that it has always been welcoming, that it's always made the effort. Wizards have decided to put disclaimers on all their products, particularly older ones, saying that they do not necessarily reflect current blah, 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 blah. You know the kind of thing. It's like when they removed Twain from school libraries and so on because his book contains the N-word, which I hate self-censoring for, but YouTube's particularly twitchy about that. Even though the book is making a point, right, about how bad American slavery was, and it's using the proper language of the time, they feel that they have to remove it or censor it or stick warning labels or whatever in it. But even in this case, the RPG issue isn't like that. So take Oriental Adventures, right? That has been a focus of the current fuss. I think because of the title, honestly, Oriental went from being a sort of generic, general term to describe Eastern Asia and being perfectly acceptable to being seen as somehow linked to colonialism and whatever. It's an archaic term, so to an extent you can kind of understand that. And it groups all of these East Asian communities together, which isn't great. And that's been a big focus of the attacks. And as a result, that has the disclaimer. But we still have many of the original creators still around, albeit they're old men now, right? And they're not necessarily politically correct. But if you go looking at Oriental Adventures, it was very progressively for the time, it was run past a bunch of people from Asia, specifically Japan, I think a couple of others as well, to go through it looking for authenticity and to make sure it was good and it was right and it was accurate. And this was in the 80s. When exactly? Oriental Adventures, publication date. Yeah, this is before the dawn of sensitivity readers and all the rest of it. This was November 1985. 1985, right? And they went out of their way to find people from the culture that they were riffing on to examine it. And yet it's still being seen as insulting today. Those people, their involvement, the motivation behind that is being given no ground whatsoever. Of course, they weren't doing it for sensitivity reasons, they were doing it for accuracy reasons, but these things often amount to the same thing, right? Nerds want to get it right. Weebs want to understand Japan better, right? That's why they object so much to localization of anime, right? Same thing here. And yeah, it's a pastiche of primarily Japanese culture, but then all of the medievalist fantasy lands that they have that correspond to Europe, these are all pastiches of Western material, right? Nobody really complains about that. D&D and other fantasy games have pretty much always been derivative, usually of Tolkien, Jack Vance, maybe C.S. Lewis, maybe Robert E. Howard. You know, it's always derivative. It's always inspired by, to one extent or another. That's a big thing in gaming. There's not a lot of truly new ideas, and when you do a truly new idea, it doesn't necessarily work too well. It can be too weird or too unfamiliar for people to get a hook on and to play. So what's the difference? That they're white people who were writing about Western European pastiches, and that was okay because they're white, but they're Americans, which never had a European medieval period, and they get a lot of things wrong, certainly, but there doesn't seem to be the same sort of fuss. So is it just that they're the wrong skin colour? Or someone wasn't paid to check it over for sensitivity, except they were, but it was for accuracy? What's the deal here? Now, unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of people that I otherwise respect in the RPG community going off and saying, look, this is the right thing. Yes, this was horribly racist, blah, 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 blah. It's not. And this is, for a lot of people, the last straw and a line in the sand, right? The disclaimer is implying, it's making the implicit accusation that these things are racist, sexist, homophobic, blah, 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 blah. You know how it goes, right? And also, as a result, it's implicitly saying that the people who made it are all those things. But like I said, a lot of them are still around, and they object. And who is this for? It's pissing off the older audience, the core audience, the people who pay the most, the people who support every edition, though they got turned off from 4th ed. And it does not placate the woke scolds to do this. They're already boycotting. All this has done is created a smaller boycott movement on the other side of the hobby, the older people. You know, all you can ever do is do your best. And if that's not good enough, tough. But trying to pander to these people never seems to work. They're never happy. So what is the point of cannibalizing and destroying your core audience in pursuit of an audience that doesn't care? I don't get it. And it's particularly distressing yet again to see people who I otherwise respect in the gaming industry straw-manning people's objection, not understanding why there is a counter campaign to try and get this disclaimer thing removed, why it's seen as insulting, why it's seen as upsetting, and why are you prioritizing one set of offence over the other? None of this makes sense, and it's a huge concern for all creative enterprises. It used to be, you know, the BBC would get 10 calls complaining about a TV show, right? And they would assume that was speaking for a whole bunch of other people who were upset but never said anything, and then they would apologise and retract or change. But that was coming from the right and from old people. This is coming from the left, the pseudo-left, the new left, and young people. And there doesn't seem to be a good reason for it. Maybe I'll do a full-on video on that later in the week. Right, let's have a look at what you've been saying. Go through any comments, or if there's anything else you want me to comment on, do let me know. Let's have a quick look at what you're talking about. So yeah, just throw comments and questions at me. Morning Adam, morning Ben, morning Sonic, hope you're doing well. Someone was bitching at me about the Netherlands the other day, which is where you are, isn't it? Saying that it's like, oh, it's a court of foreigners. Stupid white supremacist. Hi Joe, glad you're here. Adam, presumably talking about the Martian rover, saying hopefully they took account of the pointy rocks this time. Yeah, I imagine they will have. It's the drone that I'm super interested. I mean, life, yeah, I'm interested, but we're unlikely to get any kind of sort of slam dunk that there once was life on Mars, or there still is. But the drone, you know, that's something new. So I'm really hoping they land this one successfully, and the proof of concept for the drone works, because that opens up all kinds of things, not just on Mars, aerial drones or other kinds of rover. That's super exciting. Like if we can land something on Europa that can drill down into the ice and get deeper samples, that would be super interesting and super amazing. If we can get dirigibles on Titan or something, that would be fantastic. But yeah. Joe asks, is Keir another Tony, as in Tony Blair? I think Tony Blair had a legal background as well, but I don't think they're the same. I don't think Keir would make the same mistakes when it came to war and so on. So maybe a more careful version of Tony Blair, but he's also less populist and more pragmatic and more intellectual, I think. So he has many of the good aspects of Blair, and he's back towards the centre of the party, but not quite so destructive as Blair, I don't think. He's certainly someone who could be elected and who still retains important left-wing values, probably more than Tony Blair. But he's electable, and I didn't think that Labour had a chance in hell of dislodging the Tories next election. I still don't know, but I feel more hopeful with Keir involved. Joe says, the disclaimer thing is crazy. Just ask for print on demand. If enough folks want it, Wizards will sell it. You can get a lot of the old material print on demand through drive-through, so that's possible. And there's no rule against you downloading a PDF and getting it printed at lulu.com, provided you do it just for yourself personally, because you own the content, right? It's no different to going to a copy shop or printing and binding it yourself. So when I bought all the Dragon Warriors PDFs, I put them all together and bound them in a book myself. I need to get a replacement because it's falling apart because it's too big. But yeah, it's something you can do. I just didn't put it on general sale. And it was cheaper to buy all the PDFs and get them printed, because printing is pretty cheap. So if you want a copy of a lot of these old things, then why not? There was another adventure that they were upset about, Island of the Ape Men or something. It had green-skinned humanoids in it, not black-skinned, though they looked kind of tribal. But the module, I looked at some old reviews and a naughty copy of it, it spends an awful lot of time going into the culture, and it's obviously inspired by Polynesian and African and Maori culture, amongst others. They took the time in to research and understand it, even though that doesn't necessarily come through in the adventure. But all they see is some tribal-looking people with green skin and particular features and decorated shields and so on, and they lose their shit without bothering to understand that, that is real stuff from the real world. People do look like that. People do dress like that. People do tattoo themselves like that. They just knee-jerk react and don't bother to look and see that actually when you dig into it, there's a fairly nuanced and well-researched culture to this adventure, even though you're unlikely to interact with it necessarily. People have been calling me racist, right? Known racist. I've been trying to figure out why, and I haven't found much. Why they would think that. Of course, to be colourblind is now considered racist, but even so. One thing I did find was, in Tales of Gore, and this isn't my choice, I probably wouldn't have made it, but John Norman refers to the sort of transplanted American Indian, Native American communities as red savages, right? Which you can see how that would trigger people, but again, if you look into how Norman approached Native American culture here, it's intensely respectful and fully realised, and sort of understands the culture and its norms and its differences and its issues and so on. They're called red savages because the peoples of civilized Gore are prejudiced towards them, right? So it's a reflection of the prejudice within the setting, and obviously not prejudice that Norman had. And of course, when I produce the work, I have to respect the original author and their creation, so I use the same terminology, and they think that's racist without bothering to dig into it and think about it. It's very, very strange. Very strange. Ben asked, should Japan apologise for monkey and its appropriation of Chinese culture? Japan and China have this weird relationship. Japan used to take its cues from Chinese culture on what was important and interesting and fashionable and so on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The Japanese concubines would blacken their teeth in the way that that Chinese noble ladies and so on would do. I think monkey and other foundational legends of Buddhism and so on I think they transcend boundaries. But yeah, it was weird watching the Japanese production of a Chinese myth translated badly into English, but that's part of its charm. So who knows? Joe says, Oriental Adventures is homage from Shaw Brothers movies and The Legend of Monkey. What about all the Palladium books? Well, they have disclaimers. Sheesh, people are bonkers. I don't think they care so much about Palladium. They're very much an also-ran sort of company with their own issues, but I don't think they care about Palladium. I don't think they care enough about Palladium. It doesn't have the profile that Wizards does, and a lot of these people aren't even aware of anything past D&D, and if they are, it's going to be indie games. Ben says, nice of people to crap on the past while continuing to profit from and reaping the fruits of its labour. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say to that, other than, yeah. Adam says, waiting for all the shouty, sweary, blue-haired, intersectional feminists, God, that's a mouthful, to apologise for their appropriation of Japanese anime culture. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Joe says, honestly think they don't want older gamers involved. Isn't that slightly anti-libertarian? These contradictions and pseudo-left are hilarious. I find them hurtful rather than hilarious. It's ageist. It's certainly anti-liberal, yeah. But then they're starting to disassociate themselves even from liberal as a label or a term or a form of politics as well. So very much embracing their authoritarian left side. All that's going to happen is the OSR is going to see another resurgence. People are going to make their own D&D with blackjack and hookers, and that's what happened during 4th Ed, and it created an incredibly vibrant community that largely didn't give a shit about this stuff and was all the better for it. Ben says, like a petulant grandchild enjoying the inheritance from his grandparents while urinating on their graves for having had old-fashioned ideas. Yeah, I mean, part of the understanding of the past is contextualizing what people thought and said and did at the time. And the thing is, if you look back at the people who founded D&D and so on, they were all pretty right-on hippies for the most part. Albeit historians and wargamers and so on as well. But Gygax was certainly a fairly bit of a party animal, really. So it embraced the hippie side, despite being quite religious in a lot of ways later on. Yeah, these were liberal, right-on people for the most part. And that's been my experience of the community for as long as I've been a part of it. Adam says, interesting development that printing on demand seems to have appeared with not much fanfare. It's quite important as far as making publishing available to all goes. Yes, very much believe that. There is a problem with all these centralized electronic outlets that a lot of older stuff can be censored or even removed from your device if it's published through Amazon and so on. And this is why I'm not generally as down on piracy as a lot of people are, because I think piracy also necessarily results in an important archiving of old books. So I find it hard to condemn pirates outright, and places like Trove, because they fulfill that important thing. There was a blow up on there's a UK game designers mailing list which I'm still on for some reason, haven't been banned yet, but they had a very conservative, very negative outlook on piracy. But for me as a small creator, I think I found it useful in terms of creating awareness of my products, and in terms of archiving books that can be hard to get or are out of print and so on. What's in my Dragon Warriors book? So the main core book, the bestiary, what else? The Friends or Foes book of NPCs. Sleeping Gods. The Elven Crystals. Prince of Darkness, Fury of the Deep. And then I had to get a second one done, which has the Player's Guide and Cold Fury, and the various tales, like the Miller's Tale, and that in there. So yeah, I wanted to have two big reference tomes of the whole thing. Right, well, I think we're done. We seem to have run out of questions and so on. Hit me up on social media. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell, share the video once it's finished uploading and everything. I have work to do, lots of work. And if you promise to do playtesting on my Grimdark rules, get off your ass and send me the information. I will see you tomorrow for regular videos and so forth. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Keep your mask on if you go out. Have a good one. Tomorrow is Tuesday, so it'll be the Dragon Warriors game on this channel at around 7:30 PM UK. If you want to watch, or there might be even a space to play, and we have pre-gens. I'll see you then. Zang.